Michelle, we've met for the first time in 2015. Pretty much that, no, actually earlier. It wasn't
Yeah.
July. It was somewhere in early spring, early the year. And you reached out and said, "Hey, you do the TEDx San Francisco conference. We should talk." And very often, when you're curate of the conference, you want to seek people and people who address you and approach you. You shy off a little. It's kind of a weird thing organizing events, but magic brought us together. We met. You gave this incredible talk at TEDx San Francisco in 2015, and you're one of the few speakers that I've met in my life, that I speaker coached. I've been working over 100 TEDx events, speaker coaching probably way over 1,000 speakers. But you are among the very few who, even after their talk, continuously and constantly and almost monthly, weekly, daily basis inspired me. So I feel privileged calling you a friend. It might be a distant friend, friend from another life, and everyone's having their own life. But every time we
Yeah.
meet and chat, it's just beautiful and enhancing for me. Thank you so much for taking time for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm happy to pass the virtual stage over to you now.
Awesome. Yeah. So I guess to begin the conversation, it would be most effective to kind of tell you what I'm doing now in my life. So currently I work at Abbott Structural Heart as their lead market development project manager. And on the surface, my job is quite simple. I work every day with surgeons and doctors, salespeople, marketing teams to build tools to best educate people that are currently struggling with heart failure. Um, but to the core, my job is incredibly important because I consistently focus on bringing diversity, inclusion, and equality to the healthcare space so that healthcare is accessible and easy to understand for every person in the United States that I deal with. My passion for people comes from a background of a childhood with parents who were small business owners who also had a passion for people. But I don't have a college degree. My parents don't have college degrees. I grew up in a very small community in Central California that had about 500 people. My parents owned a livestock supply company. I'm their only daughter. And ultimately, the core of my life is quite ordinary. It was great, but it wasn't anything special. And I lost my notes. So it's quite easy to say that working for a large medical device company at the age of 22 is a bit interesting for the background that I come from, but how I got here has been very incredible. But I don't consider myself to be an extraordinary person. I do consider myself to be an ordinary person who I, at a very young age, understood that if I wanted to make a mark for this world, I was going to have to carve out space for myself in the world. Because coming from my background, the tech space and really all corporate and business spaces don't always have room for people like myself. But to begin with, I wasn't always so much focused on diversity inclusion within technology, but I did begin at a very young age questioning the status quo. And that story kind of starts when I was 14 years old and I ran for Miss Rodeo California. Rodeo pageants are quite similar to beauty pageants in that we take young girls and we judge them upon their backgrounds and their appearances and sometimes their intelligence, but mainly on their appearances. And what I was up against that I didn't quite realize when I began was not only was rodeo already a predominantly white sport, but because I was in the second largest rodeo state across North America and really across the world, I was the only brown girl. I'm biracial. My father's Mexican. My mother's Australian. But I obviously look brown. And so I was up against a lot of things in that year of holding my title, which came with a lot of scrutiny and a lot of being told that I couldn't do things necessarily because I fit outside of the normal standards. But I, instead of letting it berate me and defeat me, I instead decided to spend the year doing absolutely everything that this organization didn't want me to do because I wanted to carve out space for the next girl that was going to come along and be brown or be a little bit different looking than everybody else that had come before them. And so when I met Nikki, I was 16, and I had been writing about how women and young people who are different should never apologize for their differences, but instead be celebrated because they bring a new level of diversity to any of their areas of interest that we don't quite normally see. Because obviously our world has a background of excluding those that are different, and now we are entering a time where we're including and celebrating those who are different because they bring a new level of productivity to the things that we are doing. So when I was 16, I met Nikki in a sushi restaurant in San Francisco, and I said that this was my story and I really wanted to tell it. And I never imagined that a person from my background who grew up on a farm and went to really small, underfunded public schools, whose parents didn't really know how to navigate the education system, would get such a brilliant first meet into Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And that was through TEDx San Francisco. And it really sparked this new love that I had for working in technology, working in entrepreneurship, and carving out a space for people that came from diverse backgrounds. And so after high school, which came about 2 years after speaking at TEDx San Francisco, I decided to move to San Francisco to go to school there, but also I wanted to carve out some space in entrepreneurship for myself. And the first year was going quite wonderful. I was going to San Francisco State University. I was ghostwriting for some really inspirational and amazing people in the technology world. I got to ghostwrite for Steve Wozniak. I was working consulting for different startup industries. And I ended up transferring to Stanford University after my freshman year of college. And so I was on this really incredible route towards becoming somebody that I wanted to become within the tech industry. And then I hit my head and my life quickly changed. And so the story of that is that I grew up riding horses. I was incredibly competitive, and I decided to ride at the college level. And one day at just a very normal practice, my horse took a trip over a jump and I hit my head. And 2 months later, I would discover that I had actually had a traumatic brain injury that was not caught the first time at the hospital. And I would be diagnosed with epilepsy, which started a new experience of becoming an even more diverse person, but it also kind of halted my life for a bit. I dropped out of university. I quit working on almost all of the projects that I was working on, and I kind of holed up in my house because I didn't know how to understand how not only was my life so much different now, but now I was going to be a brown girl from a low socioeconomic area who wasn't going to finish school, who now had to battle with the fact that she had a chronic illness. And I took my 6 months and I kind of let my life fall apart. And then one day, my life is very serendipitous. And so one day I saw a Facebook post about a startup company that their girlfriend was running, and they needed somebody to do SEO, and it was in biotechnology. And I really needed a job because my parents had told me that if I didn't get one, I was going to have to move home in 2 weeks. And one of my biggest fears is having to move back to a small town. And so I started working at this startup company. And it really introduced me to the world of healthcare and biotechnology and how we can use technology to really help patients. And that was where that passion came from. But behind all of it was this amount of resilience and bravery that I had to have to say that even though my life had changed drastically, I still needed to continue on the route to carving out a space for myself, because as always, it isn't necessarily about me, but it's about the precedent that I'm setting for other people. It's about the fact that there are, in the United States, 17% of the US is made up by Latinas and Latinos, but within the tech industry, there's less than 6% of them working in computer and mathematics. And so I was always understanding this, always understanding that people with chronic illnesses keep up less than 2% of some of the work industries. And so it was my job to battle this. But of course, as soon as I got there, there was some issue. My second week of working, an employee was sitting with me at lunch, and she said that she was incredibly surprised that a startup industry or company would hire somebody with epilepsy, because startup companies need reliable employees, and people with epilepsy weren't very reliable. And it was obviously incredibly wrong, but as always, it inspired me to work that much harder. And within that company, I started saying, why aren't we marketing to people from diverse backgrounds? Why are we continuing to throw out resumes because somebody didn't go to an Ivy League university? Why are we throwing out the resumes of people who haven't worked in the tech industry before, but they've obviously shown quite a bit of intelligence in their past industry, and now they want to make that introduction? The most important part about having diversity and inclusion in the tech space is that when we have diverse and inclusive teams, we have diverse and inclusive products, which then create an atmosphere that it helps the world in many more ways. A lot of the time we build technology for a certain group of people, and we don't understand that there's an entire world out there of people that don't necessarily have access to these things, merely because the products are not being made for them. So I did my job at that startup company, and that's how I ended up at Abbott Structural Heart, where ultimately their market development team and their marketing and sales was failing, because within healthcare, we don't normally market our products to people all around the world. We market normally our products to people that are educated, can afford healthcare, and can actually read and understand what we're giving to them. So sometimes I came in and they would say, well, why aren't people in Filipino communities using our products? And I said, well, maybe because the brochures that you're giving these people are in English and they're at a 10th grade reading level. So these people can't use your product because they can't even read about it to begin with. And we see in tech all the time that across the board, we're not marketing to other people. We're marketing to white, literate people, which I understand it's quite easy to do that when the people that are working in tech are white, literate people who come from upper class backgrounds, who are now building products for people who they think are just like themselves. The world is that every single day we're becoming more and more diverse. People are coming from different backgrounds, and now we are understanding that just because you come from a lower socioeconomic background, or because you didn't grow up speaking English, or because you're not from the United States, you can still make that jump into technology or whatever industry you might want to. But we can't include those people until we start making environments for those people. Looking for diverse candidates, it helps you get the best talent. Diversity in tech increases employee engagement. You can retain your best employees with a diverse workplace. Your developers are always more satisfied in a diverse environment. Ultimately, diverse teams do better work. And so when we hire diverse people, they continue to also hire more diverse people. And we're seeing this change in technology from where companies used to be all male to now we're including women of color, we're building diversity boards, and we're making tech a more open and inclusive place. But it requires a lot of bravery and resilience from the first people who are recognizing this is a giant issue, and rather than just taking it, we need to begin to hit it head on. We need to be uncomfortable, and we need to make people start apologizing. What we have seen in the last few weeks in the Black Lives Matter movement is a lot of companies making statements on how they do not tolerate intolerance in the workplace, that they are a diverse background, but unfortunately the facts don't line up with a lot of what we are seeing. Uber can release statements constantly about how they don't support intolerance, but within their workplace, they have some of the highest cases of sexual harassment in the workplace and intolerance for others. So we can talk the talk, but a lot of the time in technology, we are not walking the walk. And it is the job of individuals, not necessarily always the corporations, because if you leave it up to them, they will kind of sweep things under the rug. which is what I'm always doing within technology. Rather than trying to hide on my resume that I am biracial or trying to hide that I have an illness, I always lead first with that. And I say, because of these things, I am going to be this much better of an employee because I actually understand that not everybody in the world is exactly the same. We're no longer cookie cutter, and we have to begin to understand that people are completely different. But the fact of all this is that there is hope to be had, and the future of the tech industry lies in the hands of employees and people like yourselves who are willing to have these conversations about inclusion and being brave and being resilient in the face of a status quo that desperately needs a change. And so every day we're seeing tech employees and new startup founders and investors who have a completely fresh pair of eyes because they come from such diverse backgrounds. And what used to be painfully clear is now that we have a commitment from the top is no longer optional, and it is a must. And so we're seeing a complete change in technology. So that's kind of what I'm up to. And I always like to have a conversation. So I'd love to get other people's ideas and what they're working with when it comes to diversity and inclusion and kind of how they lead their careers.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing this and sharing your journey, and kudos to your development, your personality. I mean, it's not that I've met you somewhere where I didn't find you already inspiring, and now you are. You started at a high bar, and as I said before, you just keep on impressing me with the way how you see the world. Marcus inboxed me or chatted me earlier with a question. So Marcus, why don't you just go ahead?
Well, it's a couple of things actually, Michelle. Sorry, Michelle. So for a little while, I was in charge of recruitment for a place called EY, that's Ernst & Young. Where I was responsible for UK and a little bit of North America and Asia Pacific. And so it was a big job. And one of the things which I noticed is that people have gotten an unconscious bias a subconscious bias for no reason at all. But mostly that we just weren't getting applications from people. And the note which I sent to Nikki about the questions, what was it in your upbringing which led you into, if I can paraphrase it, almost thinking that this world wasn't for you? And I think you used words like, when I grew up, people like me didn't, people like me don't.
Right.
So I'm just really intrigued.
Yeah, I think there was a couple of things that I began to notice as a child. And I really thank my parents for my dad was always asking why. And it's probably my least favorite thing about my father, but he taught me to always ask why. And something that I noticed from a very young age was that I grew up an hour from Silicon Valley. And I went to a public school that was for kindergarten through 8th grade. And there was about 300 of us kids because it was a public school for 2 towns. And we were an hour from Facebook, we were an hour from Google and all these large tech companies. And my school had 1 working computer in their computer lab. And I thought at a really young age, how are any of us supposed to become engineers if absolutely none of us have access to a computer? I didn't have access to internet at home because I grew up in the middle of nowhere. And so did everybody else in my town. And the other thing that I began to notice was that everybody that my parents knew, my father had known since he was a child, because my father grew up in the town that I was from, and he had never left. He had always worked there, and he had no intentions of ever leaving. He didn't want to travel. He didn't want to experience new things, but he always told me that first second that you can, you have to get out of here because there's an entire world out there. But I didn't have the same opportunities as everybody else. I didn't have opportunity to go to incredible after-school programs that were teaching us about robotics. I didn't have a computer at school, and I really didn't have one at home because all we did was play outside. And so I didn't have this introduction. And so I thought, well, by the time I get to where I want to be in the tech industry, I'm going to be light years behind everybody else. And thankfully, I told my parents that at a very young age. And I remember when I was younger, I would be maybe 7 years old, and my mom was driving me to Palo Alto to go to book readings at bookstores, and my parents were sending me off to the summer to summer camps, and my father had to work so many extra hours, but he was consistently doing it to put me in that space. But as soon as I got to those spaces, I realized that I was the only one there. I was the only brown girl whose dad farmed and was on a tractor every day. I was one of the only ones whose parents didn't have college degrees. And so I knew that those people had so much more of a head start over me. And I see now that a lot of those friends that I grew up with in high school, they actually still live in the town that I'm from. And they might have gone to community college for a few years, but sometimes it's just easier to do what's most comfortable. And that's something that we run into a lot with people like backgrounds for myself, is that it's really, really comfortable to just stay home.
So for people in Silicon Valley, 1 hour drive away from your tiny little farming community, what advice would you give to them on how to get talented people overcoming their own prejudices about, it's not for me, I don't even know this stuff exists? Do you think it should be for people like you to find out about Silicon Valley, or actually is it for Silicon Valley to go and say, look, here we are, this is what we do? Which do you think should be the instigator?
I think that it's both ways. And something that's been really incredible in the community that I'm from is a few years ago, a gentleman that was from my town who had done the same thing as me, he found a career in technology, he came back to our community. Right. And he started a company for young people to learn about computers. And he has people working there from our town that he recruits them back from Silicon Valley, the very few that we have. And they're teaching these children about how to code and how to be an entrepreneur and how to basically discover the world of tech. And so they came back, but they also urge our kids to go there. I do yearly work for this company where I mentor kids just like me who go to schools just like I did. And I'm like, hey, you can find the opportunity, but you absolutely have to search for it. But I also think that tech companies need to do a better job of starting programs in small towns, engineering programs, robotics programs, mathematics and science programs, because there is so much untouched talent in these towns that until we build a bridge and we both make the decision to work together, we're going to continue to no longer know who one another is.
Okay. Nikki, is it okay if I ask one final question? So I have to say, now, I don't want you to think I'm rude, but you don't look very brown to me. And I'm wondering, would it be worse or better if you were black?
Well, that's a conversation that a lot of people are having. And so I couldn't tell you, but I would probably say it would be worse because the situation for African Americans in the United States is quite dire. I'm fortunate that I live in California, and so for me, being brown here is kind of just like being white, because a lot of the people here are brown. Every girl that I grew up with, they happen to be biracial, where they're brown and they're white, and I'm actually the darkest one about all of them. And I look quite Mexican, but in California, it's quite normal. Yeah. I go into other parts of the state or in other parts of the country and try to work there. A lot of the time what happens with African Americans and Hispanics and people of color is that we become the token brown person. Companies love to hire us so that they can say that we are diverse. I am normally the only brown person on my teams. I actually currently don't work with anybody else who is Hispanic, and I have about 2 other coworkers who happen to be black. And for our company, that's their diversity stamp of saying that they do hire people like us. I do believe that the situation is worse for African Americans only because they have more of an unequal opportunity from their childhoods to access education. For us, our inclusion into the tech world begins at a very young age, where we have a lower literacy level than other areas. And so it starts at a very young age. We come out of the gate losing.
Would it surprise you to know that in the UK and in Australia, the most deprived group, or the group which is least active in all of this, are what we call white working class boys. Working class indicates they've got jobs, but they don't. And so they consider themselves to be a strata below. And they're the ones who get completely nowhere in all of this. They're the highest rate of unemployed. They're the highest rate of everything. And in Australia, as well as UK, that's the grouping. Sounds like that's not the case where you are.
It wouldn't surprise me, because, you know, just as right now the conversation is really on accessibility for people of color, there is a large demographic of the United States that are white working class people that live in like the Appalachians, that they are desperately poor. And so it isn't always necessarily a black and white thing. I think it's important to talk about racial differences in the United States, but it is incredibly important to talk about. It is normally actually that the upper class consistently keeps the lower class down. And that's something that we've seen since the beginning of time in the United States, is that it is easier for the people on top to keep the people on the bottom poor. And so they limit the access to education, they limit the access to infrastructure, and they limit the access to jobs, because it keeps a large gap between the upper and the lower. And that's something that we don't necessarily always talk about, because sometimes it is easier to have a black and white conversation, because it gives one group the ability to place the blame on the other group, rather than recognizing that sometimes it's just the people on the top that are consistently keeping the people on the bottom down.
Michelle, I have a question. You're talking right now, you're talking to an audience in the ivory tower. We're all live a very privileged life. I don't want to say it takes two to tango, but you are a combination of kindness and inner strength. What is your message to the people who are different? What is the message to the other, right? Not the ivory towers, but those who have to be strong.
So I think what happens with a lot of people like myself is it's very easy to say that the world is against us, and because of that, it is the job of those on top to make space for us on the bottom. But a lot of the time it comes down to just being resilient and just understanding that life is not fair. Life is more difficult for some of us, and we have to make the space for ourselves, because it isn't really the job of those on the top to pick individuals and bring them up. And so as more people like myself choose to rise up and choose to place themselves in that great ivory tower, we create the space. And so we need to bring others up with us, but we can't rely on those on the top to just pick us up and say like, hey, we're going to bring you here because we feel bad for you. It's work on both ends. And as we do this, we change the status quo.
Mm-hmm. I also recently, I mean, still until today, there's a lot of conversation about resilience. And I feel like resilience is something very passive. You just stay straight, right? Things are happening around you and you stay upright. That's resilience. But that doesn't mean that you're pushing the envelope. And it's kind of interesting for me, also being in a situation of being vulnerable and having to be resilient, but at the same time, I also find that loophole where I push the envelope, where I move on, where I find the next version of myself. Not only to be resilient, but actually to be acting and steering my life towards. How's that for you? How's that momentum from just stand up straight, let things happen, be resilient, but then also know that you have to move on. You don't have to only have to accept the pain, but you have to actually work against the pain or towards the pain.
So I think for myself, I've always felt that my life was quite serendipitous and that things really always happen for a reason. And as you know, in the past few years, my life has been very difficult. But I take those things and I learn from them and I appreciate them. I always say that I don't necessarily enjoy having epilepsy, but I am quite happy for the journey that it has taken me on, because I know that I wouldn't be sitting here had I not had epilepsy. I know that I wouldn't be sitting here had people not told me from a young age that I was different and so I didn't belong, that I was in the space I was in. And so a lot of the time I take things and I withstand, because I know that I'm learning so much from it, and then I can push the envelope. And I've learned too, it's really about playing your cards right? Sometimes you just have to take it and you just have to grin and bear it. And sometimes you can really push it and say, nope, that's not acceptable, and I'm going to push back on that. And no, I'm not going to accept that. And so it's really about learning like this balance between taking it and letting yourself get knocked down and then saying, okay, that's enough. I'm not going to take that. I'm going to push on this because this is going to push the envelope just a little bit more.
Any more questions from you guys? Also, Marcus, I didn't want to cut you, right? If you have, keep the conversation running, ask your questions. But also, everyone else in the room, where have you been on a stage where you felt vulnerable, where you felt hitting hard, where you felt like, okay, I have to be tough now, I have to stay resilient, or where you were in the position to not only face the situation, but walk against the situation, move forward, and become the next version of yourself? I'm curious.
Well, I can say something. Is that all right, Nikki?
Yeah, totally.
Hey, listen, everybody else, if I'm saying too much, just tell me to shut up. Martin did that last time, and he said, Marcus, you're saying everything all the time.
Shut up, Marcus. Keep it coming. Oh. No, keep it coming. Don't shut up.
Michelle, I'll just give you a little bit of background. About 5 years ago, I had a massive brain hemorrhage, and I was really knocked out. And it took me a while to recover. Actually, it didn't take me that. It took me 2.5 weeks, because I just couldn't bear not being able to do what I did. And for the first couple of months, I didn't really tell anybody. There was something wrong with me, but I didn't tell anybody. And then I decided, well, actually, I will. And what happened is people used to say, oh, I wouldn't have known. And the conversation moved on. You've said a lot about epilepsy. Maybe you just need to tell people, and they'll just say, well, you don't look like you're epileptic, so it's okay. And that might give you the self-confidence just to say, oh, shit. Actually, I have to tell you, a lot of people are epileptic. They just don't realize it until they get a grand mal.
Yeah, I think, so I've gone through quite a lot of recovery. But when I first was diagnosed with epilepsy, you most definitely would have known I had it because I was having dozens of seizures a day. And for myself, I've always connected a lot of my self-worth to my intelligence because I've always been one of the smarter kids. And so one of the most difficult parts about having epilepsy was that all of a sudden I no longer had control over my brain. And because I was going through, I wasn't as smart as I was before. But the truth of the fact is that because of the type of epilepsy I have, it does affect my day-to-day, and it does affect who I can be in the workplace, because some days I just can't do things because my brain is not working and instead I'm having seizures. A lot of people don't talk about epilepsy, and a lot of people don't talk about illnesses because it outlines that they are different and it outlines that they might not be as able. And so I talk about it because the truth of the matter is that even though some days I can't work as well, I am completely able. I am able to do whatever I want to do, but I do have to work a bit harder because there's some days that absolutely do knock me out. And I think that it's really important to talk about our differences because it outlines that it's okay to be different and you can still do the same exact job. And so I think a lot of the time people don't talk about their differences, which is quite fine. And I think sometimes people do talk about it and they might get kudos for it, but it's about talking about it, because for every person that does talk about it, there's probably 20 more that don't want to talk about it out of fear of being excluded.
Good for you.
But yes, a lot of people do not know that they have epilepsy.
What else? We had yesterday morning, or yesterday or first session, we had a conversation about the future of law, and Olga, the speaker, invited everyone to share his personal experience with law and with lawyers, and I chimed in with my current divorce. So I opened up, being vulnerable in that room. I invite you, share your stories. Where have you been looking at the wall?
I think sometimes too, one of the most important parts of this conversation is that sometimes people haven't been up against walls, and that's completely okay. I never discount people because their lives have been easier, because sometimes you have no control over the fact that you just come from a better background that has set you up for really great things. That's completely okay. In many ways, I have been very privileged, and I always accept those privileges, and I don't discount myself and I don't discount others. So one of the best parts about this conversation is sometimes you can see that you've always had the leg up, and maybe you've never taken the opportunity to bring somebody up with you. Because for every step up I take, I make sure that I bring somebody else half a step up with me. Because if I'm going to go to the top, I'm going to bring people just like me straight up with me. And so a lot of the times I've gotten where I am because people who have grown up in ivory towers have given me a hand down, and they've believed in me, and they've given me a chance. Even when there might have been candidates that were a little bit better, I showed just so much gust that I really wanted to be up there with the rest of them, and that I wasn't going to get up there if somebody just didn't believe in me. And so part of this conversation is sometimes recognizing how maybe you haven't necessarily done your part in creating inclusive and diverse workplaces, not because you don't want to, not because you have any biases, but sometimes we just don't know, because it's quite easy to be comfortable with what we've grown up with.
And I also think that with all the things that happen to your life, I think the greatest gift, you can say like the support network is a great gift, but your own personality, I think, stays always the greatest gift. How are you actually capable of dealing with a situation? And I think you shine out with a personality that, I don't know a lot of people who are capable of dealing with situation where I say, well, thank you that I have this, because it informs me, it brings me into situations, it brings me into conversations that I wouldn't have without. That's a very, very strong forward thinking. And I think a lot of people would just be self-pity about their lives and sit in the corner and cry and be paralyzed and be reliant on their support network to hold them by the hands that, hey, it's going to be okay, I'm there for you.
Yeah, I think I notice quite often with other people in my age group, in my demographic, that we're kind of teaching people that it's okay to have self-pity, and it's okay to just kind of wallow in it and let it take over your life. I think a lot of people talk about millennials and Gen Zers as being kind of whiny, and I sometimes have to agree that it is kind of a whinier group of people, because we've really been taught that spaces should be made for us. But a lot of the time you don't see that group of my generation doing incredible things because they just don't try. And so I think it also starts a lot in childhood, of having people that are teaching us from a younger age, of course, and I said this before, that life really sucks. And that's just a fact of it. And you can either get up and try again, or you can just say that life sucks and it's not fair and it'll never be fair. And so I think a lot of the time that will be the difference between me and somebody else who comes from my exact situation that doesn't ever pick themselves up, is I realized a long time ago that it's up to my own responsibility to pave the way and try harder.
We have 11 minutes to go in the session, and I just want to encourage you to share your thoughts and feelings and be open. You might regret it in 12 minutes that it's 2 minutes too late to have done so.
Yeah. Well, I would be interested for, you mentioned one point, because the people up and the lower people. So, and what we see now, especially with the crisis now, in Austria, we had a lot of we call it the middle class, and now is this middle class disrupted on both ends of the way, because people have just a successful life, this working life. They were able in the last generation to build a house and do whatever. So, and nowadays is this way of life in not able or not able to take. So, and we have a lot of unemployment, and I see it also in the US, and when we have in the news the demonstration at whatever you have. Do you think it's a question of poor and rich? Or is it just a question of frustration because the people can't get the life what they actually have planned?
So I think sometimes that can be a really difficult conversation because we hear a lot of things about like eat the rich and how life is unfair because a lot of the wealth is unequally distributed amongst groups. And I don't necessarily think that it's the upper middle class that is our issue when it comes to wealth distribution, but more so that we have a few like people in the world, like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, who are two people that have own most of the wealth, right? They have a large amount of the wealth, and they've really capitalized on the work of middle class and lower class people. And so I don't necessarily believe that people are angry because living a good life is no longer attainable. I think people are angry because they feel as though that they're being taken advantage of. And now people have different ideals of what a good life is. And so we used to see a lot of people that were very happy to always either, even work a blue collar or a white collar job, and they grow up and they get a 3-bedroom house in a nice suburbia and they work for the man, and that's just kind of what they do. And so I think what we are seeing is people are really pushing the why and the how, and are we in the masses being taken advantage of? I think that's what we are seeing, that there's a frustration with the fact that a few like people in the world have capitalized on millions of other people and their work. To kind of answer your question, I think that's where the frustration we're seeing really comes from, is that people are finally recognizing that it hasn't always been as equal as we would like to portray the world to be, and that the American dream is not necessarily as easily as attainable as we would like to believe. Within the United States, the politics in other countries, I can't always speak to, but I am in the United States, which has some of the most public and some of the worst politics at this moment.
But what could be a solution in your opinion?
In my opinion, right now, it's being made very easy by the upper levels to make this a black and white issue in America, rather than a rich and poor issue in America. And so before we can really address a lot of the issues with classes, we have to address that there's a lot of issues amongst different races and different groups of people, and that we really won't be able to get anywhere until we unite. And we see that our politics in America is currently on fire, with people just hating one another, purely based off of their political party. And so there will be no solution until we can kind of get past the point that people are not able to accept that there are differences in opinion.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In my opinion, as an American.
Marcus, Johan, Mark, Johan, what are your thoughts?
So just to throw a few random thoughts that have been running through my mind lately, especially with the most recent version of Black Lives Matter and how intense it's all gotten. And I think back to, my career. I spent about 25 years in this computing industry. And on the surface, I would say, we ran a wonderful company and everyone was happy and we had a lot of diversity within the company. But the reality is, I really think about it at a much smaller level, is that we had a lot of diversity out on the factory floor. So the people building products, we're in San Diego, California. So there were a lot of Hispanics there, but also a lot of Asians from Philippines and from Vietnam. There was a lot of women out on the factory floor. And as you went up notch by notch through the corporation, it got more male and it got whiter. And so I think about the staff that I was on as one of the founders of the company, and there's 10 of us sitting in the room, and the only woman there was our controller, and there was no diversity. It was all white. And it was like, but there was nothing conscious about that. I mean, we're talking, 20, 25 years ago. So it's before a lot of this discussion ever came up. But still, and I didn't work in HR, so I don't know what HR's policies were. It makes me very curious as to how things were run back then. But then you get into that whole unconscious bias sort of thing. And so now I'm thinking about every resume that I ever looked at and every person that I ever hired, and what was my decision-making process. So I don't have answers for that because I would have to have that data in front of me. But I think I speak for a lot of folks in industry who created these, relatively white companies. And thankfully, this is now coming up as a point of discussion so that people can't just hide behind, their unconscious bias, if you will. I just wish I could turn the clock back to, Nikki's point about being vulnerable. I just wish I could turn the clock back and make different decisions, or to at least have more of a discussion. I think that's the one thing I now regret as I see what's going on in the world, is that we did not have those kinds of discussions that we should have been having. And hopefully that's changing out there.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really important, is that a lot of the time companies didn't become white out of malicious intent. A lot of the time too, companies became white because they weren't receiving applicants from diverse backgrounds. And so people will say, well, how am I supposed to hire a Black person if no Black people are applying? And that's quite true. If there's nobody that are applying, then you can't really do it. And so that brings us back to the conversation of, are we making things equal from the very beginning? And maybe you're not receiving African-American applicants because most of the schools in predominantly African-American areas don't have the funding to introduce these children technology. They just merely have the funding to barely teach these children mathematics and make them literate enough to get into blue-collar work. And so I think that's the conversation that we are finally really truly starting to have, is that it starts really at ground zero. It starts from the very beginning of making education more accessible for people, because the best people in technology, as we know, they come from incredible educated backgrounds. And that's why we work with some of the smartest people in Silicon Valley, is because they are people that went to Harvard and Yale and Stanford and all these wonderful programs, and they come out of the best engineering programs, but they got there because of their root of education. And that's something that we really need to start talking about, is how are we making this accessible from the very beginning? We build it from a young age.
I would say one bright point for me, I mentioned that I had, done my tour of duty with TEDx, and when I saw you, you looked familiar and your story was familiar, and I'm pretty sure we met at TED Fest 2018.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, but the last event that I produced was a youth event last March. And so all the speakers, all the performers, and the MCs were all high school students. My only rule was no adults allowed on stage. And we did a call for speakers to 26 schools in the district. And then we had I had a team of people vote on what they thought the best ideas were. So we ended up having 13 speakers. There were 3 men and 10 women. And I think there were only 2 Caucasians in the group. And everyone else was somebody of color. And there was a homosexual male, there was a bisexual female. I mean, and these were all just brilliant kids with brilliant stories to come out on stage. So my hope for the future was that these were the people who stepped up. They had a voice. They didn't wait for someone to come and approach them. So they had this attitude of, we're going to go out there and make a difference, and we're not going to just hide in the corner, and we want to be heard. And my co-organizer and I, we were just blown away with who came forward, who got picked, and how good they were. So to your point on education, even though this was just in high school, I had a very good feeling that these folks were going to make a difference going forward.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people right now are looking for immediate action, but I really think that in 15 or 20 years, we're going to see that in technology, it is a wide range of people, because we're finally realizing within our education systems that there's a lot of untouched talent. And so I think in 15 to 20 years, we're really going to see a difference, that there's going to be just purely based off of the fact that there's going to be more applicants of color from diverse backgrounds, from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so it might not be an immediate change, but I really do think that we're on the great path, because my generation is finally saying, you know, I'm a girl from the projects in Detroit, and I want to be an engineer, and I'm going to be an engineer. And so I really think that we're going to begin to see that soon.
Michelle, thank you so much. I think that's beautiful, optimistic, and forward closing words. And I would want to leave it just like that. Thank you so much for this hour together. It was just as I expected. It's very touching, very emotional, very deep, powerful. You are a light. You are a compass.
Thank you so much.
Keep on being so amazing. And thank you again for being part of this program.
Yeah, of course.
Warm hug. I'll connect you all. Take it from there. Start your personal conversations. I put in the chat the Facebook group from Michelle, the Facebook account from Michelle, so you can connect with her on Facebook and stay inspired by her. She's really an amazing personality. Thank you so much. Big hug
Thank you.
from Mel. Hope to see
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.